people on the left side of the spectrum that pharmaceutical companies can be trusted. So that's just like, everything is absolutely upside down when that happens. Okay, but you're pulling out something that's very paradoxical, because on the one hand, we've already established the case that this fundamental critique that's emerged from the universities is a critique of institutional reliability. And the basic doctrine is one of power, is that all institutions are predicated on the expression of arbitrary power, and they can't be trusted, especially if you're not in the power elite. But then you say there's a paradoxical side of that, which is that at the same time, the same people, at least with regards to their political and philosophical orientation, are increasingly willing to utilize large-scale social institutions to put forward a given agenda. I suppose maybe the difference there is that the left is perfectly willing to trust large-scale institutions if the institutions operate under the rubric of their ideological theory.
Absolutely.
So you could make that case.
They get rid of all this, yeah, absolutely. They get rid of all of the Sturm and Drang of discussion and the Congress. When they take the military over, they worship the chain of command, because whether it's transgendered subsidized surgeries or women in combat units, they can effect social change in an authoritarian chain of command fiat. So everything that makes these institutions skeptical or suspicious to the traditional supporters, that they've taken away the power of the individual, they are commissar-like, they're ideologically weaponized by the left. All of those things make it attractive to the left. So it's one of the strangest things, I think, in the history of the country, how the right has backed away from all of these investigatory agencies, military. They don't trust them anymore, because they've been, I guess their DNA is like a virus, has been recalibrated against the individual in traditional America. And the left comes in and says, we like what they're doing. We like their overreach of civil liberties, because that's the only way that we can affect these changes that 51% of the people don't want, and because they're stupid. But when you control Silicon Valley and K through 12 and Hollywood, now the military and the FBI and the CIA and the DOJ, now we can finally enact change without public support. And so I don't know where it's all going to end, but the conservatives have backed off, and in that vacuum, the left has moved in.
So, one of the things I really appreciated about reading Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago was his insistence that what happened in the Soviet Union was not an aberration in relationship to the set of ideas that made up the communist utopian vision, but a fulfillment of the, what would you call it, of the core content that was implicit in the original doctrines, right? Because the apologists on the left constantly, and still do to this day, say, well, real communism has never been tried, which I think is one of the world's most appalling excuses, by the way. But independent of that, the real notion was, well, a system of ideas had been produced that had a certain degree of internal coherence. And then if you launched that system into the world, it would run algorithmically and produce certain outcomes. And it did that in country after country. And the problem, in some sense, with the discussion we're having now is that we're not making a distinction between they that are putting forward these ideas and the algorithmic, what would you say, impetus of the system of ideas itself, right? Because it's not exactly a shadowy cabal of conspiracists operating behind the scenes to bring this about. What it is a set of ideas, most of which emerged in France and Germany and then were adopted in the United States, that have a certain ethos built into them. And the ethos is partly group identity predicated, right? The fundamental predicate is that the most important distinction between people is some element of their group identity. And then there are ideas associated with that, like all outcomes should be equal, or that's evidence of the dominance of something like arbitrary power. And another ethos would be the fundamental motivating principle of the human race is power and domination. And so those ideas have an ethos that makes itself known across time, and it elaborates, and then it becomes a system of ideas that possesses individuals, and then they act in concert with the ideas. But you don't need a formal conspiracy.
No, I think
just about.
I think I agree in a similar way. I think what we're witnessing now is the end stage of what was Wilsonian progressivism, elements of the New Deal, the Great Society program, all of which could be justified by the left to address the needs of the day and maybe to rectify some of the rigidity of the American system. But ultimately, it was built into them that eventually it would appear in this latest manifestation, because it always on the horizon there was the idea that we're marching toward radical egalitarianism by fiat, and that requires a level of coercion that's antithetical to a democratic society. It's in Plato's Gorgias, I think Socrates at one point says, well, in Athens, they will not be happy until the dogs and the donkeys can vote. And what he's trying to say is that each element of expanding the franchise, justified as it was, ultimately is going to end into the absurd, because there's always going to be somebody who says that he doesn't have the same franchise as someone else. And I think it's very similar. Like,
well, that's always the case.
I think it's built into this mindset or ideology. It's once you threw out the Bourbons, that was justified. And then you had the constitutional republic. Yes, and you can see that was. And then you had Danton. But ultimately, whether you knew it or not, you had a rendezvous with the Jacobins. Just like you had a rendezvous with the Maoists.
Right.
Just like Kerensky and the Mensheviks had a rendezvous with Bolshevik. It was headed that way until if somebody didn't derail it. And I think that's where we are today.
Okay, so this allows us to return to a theme we didn't develop enough, which is part of the purpose of a true humanities education is to transmit the difficult to acquire knowledge that actually allows people to become wise enough to forestall that inevitable deterioration towards an idiot and vengeful egalitarianism.
Yes.
Right? It takes a lot of training. Now, you said you had taught ancient languages, for example, to minority students, and people listening might think, well, what the hell good is that? And let me make a case for what good that is very briefly, because it's a case for the humanities, and you can comment on that. Well, first of all, there isn't anything you can do to empower people, which is a word I hate, more effectively than to teach them how to be deeply literate and historically knowledgeable. If you're looking to facilitate people's ability to make positive changes in their own life, there is nothing you can do that's more helpful to that than to make them literate. And if you want to help them understand who they are in the deepest sense, over and above the superficial attractions of tribalism, let's say, you have to educate them deeply in this historical realm that requires the acquisition of explicit knowledge about the central nature of the human being. And that would be the distinguished citizen, let's say, someone capable of upholding the responsibilities of a citizen and someone worthy of the rights that are part and parcel of that. And without a deep humanities education, all of that disappears because it has to be transmitted explicitly. And so that was the proper role of the universities for years.
It was. As I envision it, our role was twofold. We were going to teach a method, the inductive method, as opposed to the deductive method, so that people, when they looked at the human experience via art or literature or history, they would look at exempla, and then they would come to a general overriding conclusion that took the evidence, rather than say, I have an idea and I'm going to cherry pick the evidence. That was one thing that we taught, the Socratic inductive method. The other was we had to give them some kind of arsenal or realm of knowledge or referent point. So I know I used to Xerox maybe 500 terms, ionic order or non-compos mentes, anything I could give as an architecture. And then everybody made fun of multiply. We had mostly essay tests, but I always thought there was a value in a multi-choice test. And key dates, generals, I would always say to the student, when you leave here, I want you to know how far Sparta is from Athens. I want you to give me 3 reasons quickly why the Mycenaean Empire collapsed. And it was funny because some of our students would sit in on interviews from Ivy League professors, and they would ask these questions. And these professors, I should say ABDs, didn't have any answers for them. They had no practical knowledge. And then one student said to me, well, why are we doing this? And I said, well, it's so that you don't have to repeat every life experience that you have you're going to learn what is wise and stupid by experience, and often that experience is going to be deleterious to your character.